So I'm Jennifer Hill. I'm the Professor of Corporate Law here at Monash, for those of you who I haven't yet taught. And today it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ruth Higgins to you. Ruth is a senior counsel barrister in New South Wales, and she is a senior practicing commercial law silk. So Ruth has got a stellar reputation at the bar. I'm not going to tell you too much about her. She is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law, and she's assistant general editor of the Australian Law Journal. But I'm going to leave a number of aspects of Ruth's career to her, because she's very kindly agreed to join us for today's session to tell us about the various pathways that there are in the law. So Ruth, thank you so much. And I know my students, well, our students, they're not all my students, are very grateful to have you here. So over to you at this point, Ruth. One thing though I should say before Ruth starts speaking is she's happy to take questions as she goes along, or at the end. She'll probably speak for about half an hour or so. But if you would like to raise a question, just drop your name in the chat box and I will then call on you. So over to you at this point, Ruth. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And hello, everybody remotely. It is a discombobulating brief for a practicing barrister to be told that you have to speak for an hour, you have to talk about yourself, and you don't need to do any preparation. It's hostile to most of the norms of being a barrister, but I took the gig because Jennifer asked me. So I thought what I would do is really just explain to you how I came to the law, and then the different paths within the law that life took me along, and the different merits as I found them of all those different paths. Because I think there are multiple lives in the law, including in any one life, multiple lives that you can live in the law. My dad was a solicitor and later a judge, but it would be disingenuous to say that that's why I ended up being a lawyer. I was seduced by LA Law, which was a 1980s sun-stroked Californian law drama where the men and women had very, very large shoulder pads and bigger hair. And it was the romance and glamour of that that made me think that storming around saying I object would be a fine way to spend a life. And I don't mean in saying that to deprecate in any way the influence my dad had on me. He had been a genuinely working class boy in the suburbs of Glasgow who ended up sitting as a judge, and the trajectory of his life was in many ways much, much more remarkable than mine, because he achieved a great deal of movement and then facilitated movement in my life. So inspired partly by my dad and mostly by LA Law, I went to Glasgow University to study law. I considered going to England to study law, but English and Scottish law are actually different. As you'll know, Scottish law is derived from the civilian system and Roman law, and English law is obviously the common law on the back of the Norman conquest. And I had a weird moment of patriotism where I wanted to study Scottish law, which is ironic because I then completely abandoned the country and made my way around various common law countries for the rest of my life. But I'm actually, Glasgow University was a great place to study law, and it was great to learn the civilian legal system. I tried to study law and politics, and suggested to a man in the politics department that they should create a course of that kind for me, which met with the kind of response you might imagine it met with, that they weren't planning on commencing a course of that kind for one particular student. And I had always really loved philosophy as a wee girl. The first book I bought with my own pocket money was Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which I don't recommend anyone read before the age of 13. I think there's a particular kind of rebellious brain damage that reading Nietzsche before 13 does to you. But I was absolutely intoxicated by philosophy as a wee girl. And I think that's partly why I wanted to study politics or philosophy with law. But I ended up doing a straight law degree, which would be odd for an Australian because you are required to do another kind of humanities or science degree before or alongside a law degree. And frankly, I think that's fantastic, because I think only to study law is quite narrowing. And all of my instincts had initially been not just to study law. And as a consequence of that, in my first year or so in law school in Glasgow, I was actually pretty uninspired. Exams in Scotland have always been closed book. So you just go in with your memory and thousands of cases in your brain. And one of the first subjects in first year was the law of obligations, which quite literally involved contract tort and restitution. And we were required to learn, I mean, thousands of cases to go into that exam. So by the end of first year, I'd done well because I have a good memory, but it felt like a very arid memory test to me, that you just rammed thousands of cases into your brain, put them on a page, and someone gave you a high distinction. But the epiphany for me at law school was actually second year and studying jurisprudence. And that's pretty obvious given that I'd loved philosophy as a wee girl. And being introduced to the philosophical underpinnings of any body of law, be it private law, public law, etc., had quite a transcendent effect for me in the study of law. Because in any particular field of law, there is a historical and a theoretical foundation that is usually fascinating. And once you grasp it, actually, I think radically increases your ability to navigate that area of law. When you understand why it is the way it is and where it's come from, your articulacy and your fluency in that area it is deeply increased, I think. So jurisprudence was a complete light bulb moment for me. And then I worked even harder than I had been before. And I won the university medal and got a scholarship to Balliol College in Oxford, a Snell scholarship, which is one of the few scholarships for Scottish people to any college in Oxford, because Scots are otherwise excluded from most of the scholarships, which are for other Commonwealth countries and the like. And I was very serendipitous in that respect. My jurisprudence lecturer at Glasgow, a man, John Taziolis, who's now the head of the Artificial Intelligence Centre at Oxford University, having held professorships at King's and University College London, had studied at Oxford and had studied with Joseph Raz, and took me under his wing and suggested I go and do a PhD with Raz. So Joseph Raz, as some of you will know, is probably now the most significant living legal philosopher. He was part of a generation with Ronald Dworkin and John Finnis at Oxford in the 80s and 90s, who sort of re-energized jurisprudence on the back of Herbert Hart. And I, slightly jejunely, wrote a wee letter to Joseph saying, can I do my DPhil with you? And he was at that point a leading legal philosopher. And he wrote back and said, yes, that's fine. I look forward to meeting you in October. And studying with Joseph was one of the great gifts of my life. Joseph is an Israeli who was handpicked by HLA Hart to be his student. He spoke at a conference at which he attended a conference rather that Hart was speaking at, and asked a question. And Hart said, can you bring that man to me? That was such an insightful question. Joseph then studied with Hart and became a philosopher at Oxford. The first time I met Joseph, I think, is the first and only time I have been knee-weakeningly intimidated by another human being's intellect. I remember thinking it's now slightly inappropriate for me to talk because you're so clever. And when I first walked into his room, which is this like Dawn's room in Oxford with six gazillion books and lots of dark wood, he was sitting on the arm of a chair like a little Buddha. And I sat down and he looked at me, and moments passed, and he said, and he's got this little whispery voice. He said, I see that you are asymmetrical. And I sat there for a minute thinking, what imbalance in my personality has this man picked up in a couple of minutes? In what regard am I asymmetrical? And I'm trying to think of something clever to say. And he says, you only have one earring, which is true. I've only ever had one earring. And it was a brilliant encapsulation of the guy, because he was deeply personal, but intimidatingly precise. And his way of saying, I see you're only wearing one earring was, I see you're asymmetrical. And anyway, I studied with Joseph, and as I say, that was just an unqualified gift. He had an incredible and has an incredible generosity of intellect. And in my second year, he had a visiting professorship at Columbia University in New York. And he was allowed to take a student or two with him every semester that he went over there. And he took me in the first semester of my second year. And I spent 3 months in New York at Columbia, which was, I mean, just, it was brilliant for me because I've always worked far too hard. I still do to this day. It's clearly something I'm proving to somebody somewhere. And being snapped out of Oxford and dumped into New York is the only time I actually didn't work every day, because there was such amazing live music and such amazing theatre and such, like, it was just, even my slightly obsessive compulsive work ethic thought, no, you know, Radiohead are playing at the Roseland Ballroom, I'm going to go and see Radiohead. And I'd brilliant, like, I went to gigs and just bumped into Liam Gallagher and spent the evening drinking with Liam Gallagher one night from Oasis. Like, I had these brilliant experiences in New York that I think otherwise, I mean, to explain the difference with Oxford, I once didn't go to a lecture that Stephen Hawking was giving in Oxford because I hadn't finished the work I'd promised myself I'd finish that day. So the Oxford mentality was one that needed to change, and New York was amazing. There was an amazing, I had a visiting right to go to NYU, and NYU had every second weeks had a political philosophy workshop that was run by Thomas Nagel and Ronald Dworkin. And they invited leading philosophers and legal thinkers like Harry Frankfurt and A. John Simmons. So as well as meeting lots of pop stars, New York was an amazing intellectual climate to just go along and see these leading figures speak in their fields. And as I say, Columbia was just a great gift. I then returned to Oxford to finish my DPhil with lots of ideas, but not yet a lot on any bits of paper. And at that point, started to really think about, do I want to be an academic, which I think is a deeply valuable form of life, or do I want to be an advocate or a barrister, which I think I thought would always be the life I would choose. And in a sense, in a way to test that, in the last year of my PhD, I took an appointment as a lecturer at Corpus Christi in Oxford and taught contract tort, legal systems and juris, which is in the sort of Oxford tutorial system. It's little groups of 10 or 13 people. It's not large lecture halls. And that was incredibly interesting, because I think after a year of doing that, I realized that for all my natural optimism, there's also a little bit of melancholy in me. And if I sat and pondered the human condition every day of my life, I might end up 1% sad. And because I was doing jurisprudence and philosophy, I decided the world of affairs and being busy and being a barrister and running around the place was clearly the life for me. So at that point, I was planning to go to the bar in London, because I had sort of decided not to move back to Scotland, and had now studied English law for a while and taught English law for a while. And then in another mild twist, a very good friend of mine at Oxford came up to me one day and said, I think I know the woman with whom you're going to spend the rest of your life. And I said, who is she? And she said, oh, she's my best friend. She lives in Sydney. Now, at that point, I was reasonably terrified of getting on airplanes. Post New York, I was a little bit better with planes, but the notion that I would fly to Australia ever, or that I'd base myself in Australia ever, was ridiculous, because it involved an actual day on an airplane. And my friend Tony, who's this extravagantly handsome gay guy, just kept bugging me, saying, you have to meet this woman, you have to meet this woman. And one night, to stop him harassing me, I sent this woman, Amber, an email and said, I'm terribly sorry about this. I'm sure Tony's being as annoying to you as he is being to me. I just thought if I sent this email, he'd leave us both alone. Anyway, long story short, we then started sending emails to each other, and I flew to Australia on a blind date to go to Mardi Gras in 1999. We then fell wildly in love and stayed together for 6.5 years. And Amber came and stayed in Oxford for a little bit while I finished my DPhil, but she was very connected to Australia and very much wanted to live here. And I decided to emigrate. And I mean, I must say, when I first landed in Sydney, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Mr. Happy book by Roger Hargreaves. I don't know if it's a British kids thing, but it's like the Mr. Men series, and the final page of Mr. Happy is, on the other side of the world, something like this. On the other side of the world, where the sun shines much hotter than here and the trees are much taller, there is a country called Happy Land. And I landed in the middle of Sydney and thought, oh, this is where Mr. Happy lives. Like this is sunshine and joy and fruit that looks like it's happy, as opposed to fruit that looks like it's really sad, and vegetables that look ecstatic. So I mean, I moved as soon as I was in Australia, I was kind of like, I'm very happy to live here. But it was a big shift in my career, and then led to the next switch back in a sense, which was, in order to come to Australia, I needed to have some kind of working rights. Amber and I couldn't do a relationship-based thing at that time, and the most obvious way to come into Australia at that point was to be sponsored by a law firm. Now, I had never planned to be a solicitor. It looked a lot like hard work without the glamour to me, which is not many people's experience of it, but it just looked not my cup of tea. But the only way really to come into Australia was to be sponsored by a law firm. Amazingly, again, serendipity and great good fortune, they sponsored me to come to Australia. Now, one of the oddities of that was Liza it was a partner in the competition law group. So she did basically only antitrust competition style matters. I had always had an aversion to economics at law school. I hadn't really studied law and economics as an aspect of jurisprudence. And that was a bias. I thought economics was, in a sense, I was a big Adam Smith fan, and I believed that Adam Smith really wrote about the theory of moral sentiments, and economics was a byproduct of that. And I thought economics was astrology masquerading as astronomy. I had lots of prejudices against economics. And then all of a sudden I'm in a competition law group having to learn economics on the ground, because you really need to understand economics to do competition law. And I now have a huge respect for the discipline of economics. And I've got rid of all the prejudices I brought to that job. But there is no universe in which I would have been a competition lawyer by volition. I would not have ever have thought do a field of law that depends upon market definition and understanding industry dynamics. So that I ended up staying in the competition and litigation department at G&T for 4 years. When I started, I thought I'd stay there for a year, partly because I hadn't ever really wanted to be a solicitor. But the minute I was in the firm, the partners in the group were Liza and Gina Cascott-Lieb, and these incredibly impressive, incredibly bright women, from whom, again, I just thought this is such a gift to be able to learn from these people. And also they've been so kind in sponsoring me that I didn't think I could just spend a year there and skedaddle. So I ended up spending 4 years at G&T with the plan to go to the bar. And I also, I mean, as an aspect of that, moving 10,000 miles away from home and going to a profession like the bar, which is fundamentally about networks. It is to a very substantial extent about who you know or who you get to know. And I'd known lots of people in Scotland, and I'd known lots of people in England, and I didn't know that many people in Australia. And again, Gilbert and Tobin just gave me this great opportunity of meeting people. I did a number of matters with senior silks at the time, and again was just super lucky that the people I worked with included Stephen Gaigler, who's now in the High Court, and Noel Hutley, who's a leading senior counsel across Australia. And having met those people in that context, when I came to the bar, they got me involved in matters, which was a sort of self-propagating network for me, whereas I otherwise didn't really have one. And during the time I was at G&T, I must say I really missed academic work. I really pined for it a little bit, and I, in my first year at G&T, provided the manuscript of my PhD to Oxford University Press to try and get a book contract, which I got, and that was published as The Moral Limits of Law, which is just a hardcore jurisprudence text. It's about the conditions of political legitimacy and the circumstance in which we might have a moral obligation to obey the law as opposed to a legal obligation to obey the law. But that was amazing fun. G&T, again, incredibly generously let me go down to 4 days a week to finish that as a book. And since then, I've stayed very committed to keeping a hand in academic work. I've published 4 books since then, all of them edited collections, but one's been about rhetoric, one's been about the intersection of values and law, and the other is a 2-volume publication on the historical foundations of Australian law. And I've also contributed chapters to a number of books as well. Last year, one about Owen Dixon, and this year, one about competition law, which was easy. So I've really tried to keep a hand in that. And as an aspect of that, twice during my career at the bar, I've applied for and got visiting fellowships at Oxford colleges and taken 3 months out. And I have a book project at the moment, Law's Candor, which is about the relationship between truth and the common law. And as a judge of the Court of Appeal once said to me, if it's about the relationship between truth and the common law, how can it be any longer than a pamphlet? But that is my continuing project. And the reality is I'm now just constantly too busy really properly to attend to that. And I had a brilliant experience in my first visiting fellowship in Oxford, where the notion of having 3 months to write, I thought, gosh, I can finish the book. Because how many words would I usually spend? How many words would I write in 3 months usually, which is literally millions. And I got to Oxford and I just sat there and thought, you idiot. Because the kind of thinking required for academic writing as opposed to submission writing, where you're pulling together facts on law and fields you're very familiar with. I had that moment of realizing again, academic thinking is about trying to have an original thought. It's about trying to say something deep and profound about something that lots of people have spoken about for a very long time. And it was great. It was kind of like going back to Oxford and being made humble again, that if I was going to say anything interesting or original, I needed to spend real time thinking about it and couldn't just shovel out the first thought in my brain. Yes, I mean, I've tried to keep involved in academia in that way because I think it is profoundly valuable. Otherwise, I came to the bar in 2006. I took Silk in 2017. I worked incredibly hard for 11 years, just like stupidly hard, and did lots of brilliant cases with lots of fantastic people. And since 2017, have been a Silk practicing mostly, I mean, maybe 50% competition law, otherwise commercial law, a bit of constitutional, a bit of public, a lot of regulatory stuff. So now an embarrassing amount of economics. My former self would be appalled. And quite a bit of insolvency, which is handy at the moment because lots of companies are going insolvent. And one of the nicer moments of my recent career was the merger proceeding in TPG and Vodafone, in which I acted for TPG, who was the target of the Vodafone acquisition. And the ACCC opposed that merger, and we succeeded in the federal court. And I was instructed in that case by Liza Carver, who'd sponsored me to come to Australia. And the day we got judgment, remembering that 20 years before, I'd been a wee person trying to get sponsored to come to Australia so I could hang out with the person I'd fallen in love with. And getting that decision in TPG was quite a lovely moment of part of the arc of a life, and the good fortune that relationships in the law can bring to you. I've got 3 minutes more before I can open up to questions. So yeah, I want to be a Silk for a bit longer. I would very much like to be a judge one day, but I'm not rushing towards that because I think, and this is just a personal view, female Silks often become judges very quickly because we need female judges, but that means we're not left with female Silks. And I think female Silks have something very valuable to contribute to the culture and the life of law and the way in which courtrooms are conducted and the way in which law is conducted. And there is an extent to which we can only be what we can see, and we need more young women to see that they can be Silks running very, very high stakes billion-dollar commercial cases, and that clients will trust them and that they will win, and that will begin to change the face of the practice of law in this country a bit. I'm sure I've forgotten things about my life, but that's probably not a bad thing.
And Ruth, I hope we stay in touch with you, because now that we know you're hankering for doing all things academic, no escape.
Well, thanks a million for having me, Jennifer. It's been lovely to talk to you all. And I hope you all have wonderful lives in the law.
Thank you, Ruth.